Cicero on friendship and old age. Two Roman classics on loyalty, wisdom, aging, and a life well lived. Ancient Stoic philosophy for modern men, leaders, and lasting relationships by Aurelian Hart. Introduction. The air at the seaside villa in Astura was thick with the smell of salt and the damp chill of a fading winter. It was 44 BCE, and for Marcus Tullius Cicero, the world felt like it was ending. Outside his window, the gray waves of the Mediterranean crashed against the rocks, a constant low roar that matched the heavy beating of his own heart. Cicero sat at a heavy wooden desk, his fingers stained with dark ink. He was 62 years old, an age that in ancient Rome meant he was officially an old man. His daughter Tullia, the person he loved most in the world, had recently died. His political career was in ruins. The Roman Republic, the government he had spent his entire life trying to save, was crumbling after the bloody assassination of Julius Caesar. He was alone. He was grieving. He was afraid of what the future held. Instead of giving up, Cicero did something that would change the way men thought about life for the next 2,000 years. He picked up his pen. He didn't write a book about war or taxes. He wrote about the two things that make life worth living, even when everything else falls apart: true friendship and the beauty of growing old. He wrote these words not as a happy man with no problems, but as a man who needed a reason to get out of bed. He needed to remind himself that his gray hair wasn't a sign of weakness, but a badge of honor. He needed to figure out which of his friends were actually loyal and which were just hanging around because he used to have power. Today, we look at statues of Cicero and see a cold, white piece of stone. But that winter in Astura, he was a man just like you. He was a leader who felt the world moving faster than he could keep up with. He was a father who felt a distance between himself and the younger generation. He was a success who realized that his network didn't mean anything if he didn't have a soul to share his thoughts with. The invisible man in the glass office. Most men today are running a race they didn't realize they signed up for. You spend your 30s and 40s building a life. You work the long hours. You climb the ladder. You make the contacts and build the connections. Your calendar is full, your phone is buzzing, and people look to you for answers. But then something happens. Maybe it's a birthday with a number that starts with a 5 or a 6. Maybe it's a younger colleague who looks right through you in a meeting, as if you're already a ghost. Maybe it's the quiet of a house that used to be full of noise, but now only echoes with the sound of the television. You start to notice a strange, hollow feeling. You have thousands of friends on social media and hundreds of connections on LinkedIn, but if you had a flat tire at 2 in the morning, you aren't sure who you could call. You realize that most of the people you spend time with are transactional. They are there because of what you can do for them, not because of who you are. This creates a deep, quiet anxiety. You worry that you are being phased out. You fear that your best years are behind you and that the second half of your life will be a slow slide into being irrelevant. You look at your body and see it slowing down, and you wonder if your mind is next. You feel like a transactional man, someone whose value is tied entirely to his output, his title, and his bank account. And because those things eventually change or fade, you feel like you are fading too. The Promise of the Virtuous Elder. The book you are holding is a bridge. It is a bridge between the high-pressure, lonely world of the modern leader and the timeless wisdom of the Roman world. Cicero's two classics, on friendship and on old age, aren't just old-school assignments. They are survival manuals. By the time you finish these pages, you will undergo a transformation. You will stop being a transactional man and start becoming a virtuous elder. A virtuous elder doesn't fear the passing of time. He sees aging as the peak of his intellectual power, not the end of it. He doesn't have 1,000 contacts. He has a small circle of unbreakable loyalties. He moves through the world with a calm authority because he knows his value isn't based on a job title that can be taken away. He learns how to distinguish between fair-weather friends and those who will stand by him in a crisis. Turn the slowing down of the body into the speeding up of the spirit. Mentor the younger generation so that his wisdom lives on long after he is gone. Find a deep, lasting happiness that doesn't depend on how many people are clapping for him. This isn't about staying young or fighting the clock. It's about winning the game by changing the rules. It's about realizing that the harvest of a life well lived is much sweeter than the frantic planting of youth. Why Cicero still matters. You might wonder why we are looking back 2,000 years to solve problems in the age of AI and high-speed internet. The reason is simple. Technology changes, but the human heart does not. Cicero lived through the most stressful time in Roman history. He saw the rise of dictators, the collapse of the economy, and the betrayal of his closest allies. He didn't have a therapist or a life coach. He had philosophy. He had the Stoic idea that while we can't control what happens to the world, we can control how we respond to it. His words have survived because they work. They were read by the thinkers of the Renaissance, by the American founding fathers, and by leaders throughout history who found themselves in the winter of their lives. Cicero's wisdom is like a fire that has been kept burning for centuries. All you have to do is pull up a chair and listen. Meet Mark Sterling. To see how this works in the real world, we are going to follow a man named Mark. Mark Sterling is 52 years old. If you saw him in his glass-walled office overlooking Lake Michigan in Chicago, you'd think he had it all. He is the senior vice president of logistics for a global shipping firm. He wears expensive suits, flies business class, and has a watch that costs more than most people's cars. But Mark is standing at a cliff. Recently, his CEO pulled him into a private meeting. The talk was polite, but the message was clear. The company wants to move Mark into a senior advisor role. In the corporate world, that's a polite way of saying, we're moving you out of the way to make room for someone younger. Tonight, Mark is sitting in a luxury airport lounge at O'Hare. The air smells like expensive coffee and jet fuel, watching the blue light of his phone reflect in the glass. He just saw a younger colleague, someone he hired and trained, walk right past him without saying hello. Mark's phone hasn't rung for a personal reason in 3 weeks. His wife Elena is at home in their oversized, silent kitchen, and his 2 adult children only text when they need help with their taxes or a loan for a new apartment. Mark feels invisible. He feels like a tool that has been used until its edge is dull and is now being put back in the box. He spent 30 years building a network, but as his power starts to slip, he realizes those people aren't his friends. Mark believes that he who dies with the most toys wins. He believes that showing any kind of vulnerability is a liability. But as he sits in that lounge, he is starting to realize that his current path leads to a very lonely destination. He is a transactional man who is about to run out of currency. Throughout this book, we will follow Mark as he discovers Cicero's letters. We will watch him struggle to apply this ancient Roman wisdom to this modern Chicago life. We will see him try to repair his relationship with his son, try to find real friends among his clients, and try to face his retirement not as an ending, but as a beginning. The road ahead. This book is organized as a journey. We will start by looking at the 4 big fears that keep us awake at night. The fear of being useless, the fear of physical decline, the fear of losing pleasure, and the fear of the end. We will learn about Cato the Elder, a legendary Roman who was still working his own fields and leading the Senate at 84. We will see how he used his mind as a muscle to stay sharp while others his age were fading away. We will explore the loyalty audit, a way to look at your current relationships and figure out who is a utility friend, someone who wants something from you, and who is a virtue friend, someone who loves you for who you are. We will talk about the shared hearth, the idea of creating a space in your life for deep, meaningful connection rather than just networking. We will look at the art of the active harvest, learning how to pivot your career and your life so that you are doing the most important work of your life in your later years, rather than just clocking out. Finally, we will see how Cicero himself faced his final days. He didn't die in a bed, hiding from the world. He faced his fate with a level of courage and dignity that left even his enemies in awe. The goal isn't just to learn about Rome. The goal is to build a Roman strength within yourself. It's to move from a life of speed and greed to a life of depth and meaning. Mark is waiting in the airport lounge, looking at his phone, wondering if there is more to life than this. Cicero is waiting at his desk in Astura, ready to show him, and you, that there is. The waves are crashing, the ink is wet, the fire is lit. Chapter 1. Why do we fear the turning of the clock? Scipio Africanus and Gaius Laelius stood in the shadow of a stone archway, watching an 84-year-old man move through a field. The year was 150 BCE. The man was Marcus Porcius Cato, known to history as Cato the Elder. He was a legend in Rome, a former soldier and statesman who had spent his life fighting wars and winning political battles. But what fascinated the two younger men wasn't his past, it was his present. At an age when most Romans were either dead or huddled by a fire, Cato was vibrant. He walked with a steady pace. His eyes were sharp. He didn't seem to be carrying the heavy weight of his years. Scipio and Laelius, both in the prime of their lives and rising stars in the Republic, were terrified of the very thing Cato seemed to be enjoying. They saw old age as a dark tunnel, a place where strength vanished, influence died, and a man became a ghost of his former self. "We are amazed, Cato," Scipio said as they finally approached him. "We see you carrying your age so lightly. To us, it seems like a burden heavier than Mount Etna. How do you do it?" Cato stopped and leaned on his staff. He didn't offer a polite smile or a soft answer. He looked them in the eye and delivered a truth that would ripple through the next 2,000 years. "For those who have no resources within themselves for a good and happy life," Cato replied, "every age is burdensome. But for those who look for all good things from within, nothing that nature brings can seem like an evil." He wasn't just talking about being positive. He was talking about a fundamental shift in how a man views his own value. He told them that the problem wasn't the number of years they had lived. The problem was the character of the man living them. If a man is miserable, greedy, and bitter at 80, he was likely miserable, greedy, and bitter at 20. Age doesn't create the man, it reveals him. The weight of the calendar. The fear Scipio and Laelius felt is the same fear that keeps modern leaders awake at 2 a.m. It is the fear that life is a battery that only drains and never recharges. We look at the younger generation, the Scipios of our own companies and social circles, and we see speed, energy, and a lack of wrinkles. We begin to believe that our value is tied to our utility, a word that refers to how useful we are as a tool for others. Cato argued that this is the first great mistake. When we view ourselves as tools, we naturally fear the day we become dull. But a human being is not a hammer. A human being is a story, and a story is supposed to have a climax, not just a slow fade into a blank page. Cato saw that the young men were looking for the wrong things. They were looking for the spring blossoms of youth in the middle of autumn. He explained that every season of life has its own fruit. And you shouldn't ask an elder to be a sprinter. The struggle, Cato noted, is that most men spend their youth building a life based on things that time can take away. They build it on their muscles. They build it on their sexual drive. They build it on their ability to work 18-hour days. When those things naturally begin to slow down, these men feel like they are being robbed. They feel like victims of time. Cato's aha moment for the young men was simple. You cannot be robbed of what you have built inside yourself. If you have built wisdom, a steady mind, and a library of experiences, age doesn't take away your power. It finally gives you the chance to use it. The 4 great complaints. To help Scipio and Laelius understand, Cato broke down the 4 reasons people hate getting older. These are the same 4 monsters that haunt the modern professional as they cross the threshold of 50 or 60. It withdraws us from active work. It makes the body weaker. It deprives us of almost all physical pleasures. It is not far from death. Cato tackled the first complaint with a metaphor that every leader should memorize. He asked them to think about a great ship. The younger sailors are the ones climbing the masts, pulling the ropes, and sweating in the heat. They are the active ones. But where is the pilot? The pilot is sitting quietly at the stern, his hand on the rudder. He isn't climbing. He isn't sweating. To a casual observer, he looks like he isn't doing anything at all. He does not do what the young men do, Cato said, but he does things that are much more important and much better. The pilot's work isn't about muscle, it's about judgment. Cato argued that large affairs are not won by speed or physical agility. They are won by deliberation, character, and expression. These are qualities that don't decline with age. In fact, they grow. The transactional man fears retirement because he thinks he is leaving the ship. The virtuous elder realizes he is finally being promoted to the rudder. The freedom of the fading body. When they reached the topic of physical strength and pleasure, Cato shared a story about the famous Greek poet Sophocles. When Sophocles was a very old man, someone asked him if he still enjoyed the company of women and the heat of physical lust. Sophocles replied with a sense of deep relief, "I have escaped from it with joy, as if I had escaped from a mad and furious master." This was a shocking idea to the young Romans. They saw the loss of libido and the slowing of the body as a tragedy. Cato saw it as a liberation. He explained that when we are young, we are often slaves to our impulses. We chase things that don't actually satisfy us. We are driven by mad masters, lust, ambition, and the need for constant excitement. As we age, those masters lose their grip. The fog of youth begins to clear. This isn't a loss of pleasure. It is a shift to a higher kind of pleasure. Cato found more joy in a deep conversation with a friend or the quiet growth of a garden than he ever did in the loud, frantic parties of his youth. He didn't ignore the fact that the body gets weaker. He simply pointed out that you don't need the strength of a bull if you are no longer trying to act like a bull. He told them about Milo of Croton, a legendary wrestler who looked at his withered arms in old age and started to cry. Cato had no sympathy for him. "It is not your arms that are dead," Cato remarked, "but you yourself. You never made yourself great through your mind, but only through your biceps." The lesson was clear. If you identify only with your body, you are building your house on sand. If you identify with your mind and soul, you are building on a rock that the tide cannot reach. The U-shaped curve of happiness. While Cato was speaking from the heart of Rome, modern science has actually backed him up. In 1932, researchers began to notice a pattern that is now called the U-shaped happiness curve. If you look at a graph of human happiness, it usually starts high in youth. Then, as people enter their 30s and 40s, it begins to dip. This is the midlife crisis zone, the period where the stress of career, family, and the fear of the ticking clock is at its peak. We feel the weight of what we haven't achieved, and we feel the first stings of physical decline. But then, something fascinating happens. Around the age of 50 or 55, the curve starts to turn upward again. For many people, their 60s and 70s are the happiest years of their lives. Why? Because, like Cato, they finally stop fighting the wrong battles. They stop trying to impress people they don't like. They stop worrying about what's next and start appreciating what is. They move from the anxiety of becoming to the peace of being. Cato knew this intuitively. He told the young men that the harvest of old age is the abundance and memory of blessings previously won. A man who has lived well doesn't fear the end of the day. He enjoys the sunset because he knows he spent the daylight hours wisely. The proximity to the end. Finally, they spoke about death. This is the ultimate fear, the one that makes all other fears feel small. Scipio and Laelius were young enough to feel like death was a distant rumor. But for Cato, it was a neighbor. Cato didn't look at death with terror. He looked at it as a traveler looks at a distant shoreline after a long voyage. He used the image of a ripening fruit. When a fruit is green, it has to be torn from the tree by force. But when it is fully ripe and mellowed, it falls on its own, naturally and gently. To me, Cato said, the thought of my approaching death is so pleasant that the nearer I get to it, the more I feel like I am seeing land and am at last about to come into harbor after a long voyage. He reminded the young men that death is not a failure of life. It is the completion of it. A play isn't bad because it has a final act. The final act is where the meaning is revealed. If a man has lived a life of virtue, a life characterized by loyalty, fairness, and generosity, then death cannot take away the excellence he has created. it can only seal it. The historical echo, Cato's masterclass that afternoon in 150 BCE, changed the way Scipio and Laelius looked at their futures. They realized that the clock wasn't their enemy. The enemy was a life lived without a center. We see this same dynamic today in the world of high-stakes business and leadership. There is a reason why so many successful men fall apart the moment they lose their titles or their corner offices. They have spent 40 years building a utility and 0 years building a character. When the utility is no longer needed, they feel they have ceased to exist. But then there are the others. There are the men who, like Cato, seem to grow more influential as they age. They aren't the ones shouting in meetings or checking their heart rate monitors every 5 minutes. They are the ones people go to for advice. They are the ones who stay calm when the market crashes. They are the virtuous elders who have realized that while the body has a limit, the spirit does not. Cicero, writing this story a century after it supposedly happened, was in a moment of his own crisis. He was aging, he had lost his political power, and his beloved daughter had died. He was looking for a way to survive his own grief. He reached back into history and hired Cato to be his mouthpiece. He wanted to remind himself and us that the turning of the clock is not a countdown to zero. It is a transition into a different kind of power. The empowerment for you is this: you do not have to be a victim of time. You do not have to fear the younger version of yourself. You can choose, starting today, to stop investing in things that time can steal and start investing in the resources within. Audit your utility. Ask yourself, if I lost my job and my physical strength tomorrow, what would be left of me? Identify your mad masters. What impulses are currently driving your stress? Is it the need for more money, more status, or more speed? Find your rudder. What is one area of your life where you can move from doing, manual effort, to guiding, wisdom, and judgment? Cato the Elder lived to be 85. He died just before the start of the Third Punic War, the final conflict that would make Rome the undisputed master of the world. He didn't live to see the final victory, but he didn't need to. He had already won the only war that truly mattered, the war against the fear of himself. He proved that a man of character doesn't just get old, he ascends. And as he told Scipio and Laelius as the sun began to set over the Roman hills, that is a journey anyone can take, provided they are willing to pack the right things. Chapter 2: 4 Pillars of a Resilient Mind. In ancient Athens, everyone knew that once you hit 70, your mind was basically a flickering candle in a windstorm. They believed the brain was like a clay pot that eventually dried up and cracked. You were expected to sit in the corner, stay quiet, and let the younger men run the world. People thought that thinking was a young man's game, and once your hair turned white, your ability to learn or create was gone forever. Isocrates did not care what everyone knew. He was a famous teacher of words and logic. By the time he reached 94, his rivals were waiting for him to finally go quiet. They whispered that he was senile. They said his best work was decades behind him. They treated him like a statue that was slowly crumbling into dust. Instead of fading away, Isocrates sat down and began writing the Panathenaiacus. It wasn't just a short letter or a few notes. It was a massive, complex book about the history and greatness of his city. He spent years on it. While younger men were out partying or getting distracted by new trends, the 94-year-old was at his desk. He was connecting ideas that no one else could see. He was using a lifetime of patterns and memories to build a masterpiece. When he finished it at age 97, the world was shocked. It wasn't just good for an old man. It was one of the most brilliant things ever written in the Greek language. He proved that the mind doesn't have to be a battery that simply runs out of juice. It can be a field that grows a different kind of crop every year. The myth of the empty battery. We often look at our brains like a phone battery. We think we start at 100% when we are 20, and then every year the percentage drops. We worry that we are running out of space for new skills. We see a new piece of technology or a new way of doing business, and we think, I don't have enough charge left to learn that. This is the great lie of the fading mind. It's a myth that tells us we are destined to become slow and forgetful just because the calendar turns. Cicero, writing through the voice of a tough old Roman named Cato, argued that the mind only breaks if you stop using it. He noticed that the people who lost their edge were usually the people who decided they were finished. If you stop planting seeds in a garden, the garden doesn't just stay the same. It fills up with weeds. The senility people feared in Rome wasn't a natural part of getting old. It was the result of a mind that had gone to seed because its owner stopped tending the soil. If you believe your best thinking is behind you, you will act like it. You will stop reading hard books. You will stop asking hard questions. You will stop trying to understand how the world is changing. And when you stop doing those things, your brain will indeed start to slow down. But it isn't because you are old. It is because you are bored. Cicero believes that as long as a man kept his eagerness for learning, his mind would stay as sharp as a sword. The blind lion of the Senate. About 100 years before Cicero was born, there was a man named Appius Claudius Caecus. He was a hero of Rome, but by the time he was very old, he had lost his sight. He was blind and weak in his legs. He lived in a big house with his 4 sons and 5 daughters. Most people in Rome thought Appius was just waiting for the end. They figured he was sitting in his garden, lost in his own dark world, while the city moved on without him. One day, a powerful king from across the sea named Pyrrhus sent a messenger to Rome. This king had a massive army and war elephants. He had beaten the Romans in a few battles, and the Roman Senate was scared. The messenger offered a peace deal that was actually a trap. It would have made Rome a servant to the king. The younger senators, the ones who were supposed to be sharp and strong, were ready to sign the deal. They were tired of fighting, and they were afraid. When news of this reached Appius in his house, he didn't just sigh and go back to sleep. He told his servants to carry him to the Senate. He was blind and old, but his mind was on fire. He walked into the room where the leaders were arguing. The room went silent. This old man, who hadn't been seen in public for years, stood up and gave a speech that shook the walls. He didn't use notes. He didn't need his eyes to see the truth. He used his memory and his iron will to remind the senators what it meant to be Roman. He tore their weak arguments apart. He showed them exactly where they were being cowards. Because he had decades of experience, he could see the trap in the peace deal that the younger men had missed. He wasn't just a man talking. He was a leader with gravitas. He convinced the Senate to keep fighting, and Rome was saved. Cicero loved this story because it showed that a man's greatest power isn't in his muscles or his eyesight. It's in his ability to hold on to his character and his wisdom when everyone else is losing theirs. Mark's battle with the screen. Mark Sterling sat in his home office in Chicago, staring at a blue screen that felt like it was mocking him. His company had just switched to a new logistics system called Logiflow. It was supposed to make everything faster, but for Mark, it felt like trying to read a book in a language he didn't speak. He was 52, and for the first time in his career, he felt slow. He could hear his son Leo in the other room, laughing while playing a video game. Leo could probably figure out this software in 10 minutes. Mark felt a hot flash of shame. He thought about calling his assistant to just handle it for him. He told himself that he was a big picture guy and didn't need to know the click-by-click details. But deep down, he knew that was an excuse. He was afraid that his brain couldn't handle the new tricks anymore. He felt like that old clay pot, starting to crack. He looked down at the desk and saw an old book he had picked up at the airport. It was about Roman history. He read the story of Isocrates writing at 97. He read about Appius Claudius standing up in the Senate when he was blind and old. Mark realized he wasn't too old for the software. He was just out of practice. He had been letting other people do the heavy lifting for his brain for the last 5 years. Who stopped being a learner. He took a deep breath, closed the help tab, and decided he wasn't going to delegate this. He was going to learn it if it took him all night. The secret in the convent. Long after Cicero was gone, modern scientists found